So let's turn to the Mesut Ozil story, which continues to rumble on. This thing blew up on Sunday. Mesut Ozil released a 2,230-word statement, no less, announcing his retirement. And as retirement statements go, it was a doozy. So to discuss the Ozil statement and everything he's talking about and the fallout, which is in many ways just as significant and interesting, we're joined by Jonathan Harding, who's based just outside Cologne and whose work has appeared in Deutsche Welle and The Times and elsewhere as well. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with Mesut Ozil's 2,230-word statement then announcing his retirement on Sunday. There's a lot in this, essentially. He's addressing for the first time the picture in May, which obviously came out before the World Cup, where he met with President Erdogan in London. Confirms they first met in 2010. He says of the picture, it wasn't about politics or elections, it was about me respecting the highest office of my family's country. He says, our meeting was not an endorsement of any policies. I mean, you have sympathy for Mesut Ozil when he says that, and you take him as being very genuine, but also it's quite a naive thing to say, almost willfully naive to think that a picture like this wouldn't have caused some consternation.
Yeah, I think that's the tricky part. And I think this whole conversation is a fairly nuanced conversation. And I think that's maybe the biggest issue, that not enough people in those positions that ultimately make the decisions, and by that I mean the German FA, seem to see it as a nuanced conversation. This isn't a black and white conversation. I think it's perfectly acceptable to say that you've had a problem with the photo with Erdogan, but at the same time you find the racist abuse that Mesut Ozil has been suffering completely abominable. I personally am of the opinion, I don't know Mesut Ozil. I think a lot of people don't have the opportunity to get to know him. He strikes me as a very quiet, reserved type of guy, which makes this comment even more flammable. I think he may well have approached this situation naively and seen this situation as just meeting with a friend. And I think that might not be enough for some people, but I think it might be an uncomfortable truth. I think it's very difficult to talk about this situation without having been in his shoes, without having been in his situation. I think that's the biggest issue. Too many people might be talking about this situation having never experienced what it is to be a third generation, second generation Turkish man born in Germany, grown up in Germany. It's an extremely difficult situation to grow up in. And I think that's why it's difficult to relate to for a lot of people, and that's why their angles of argument might not be the most accurate. Yeah,
so whether you agree or not, that is his explanation of the meeting with Erdogan, that it was not an endorsement, it was respecting the highest office of his family's country. He talks in a statement about various other issues which he feels he's encountering. So the media come up for a bit of a tongue lashing. He says that German media outlets repeatedly blame my dual heritage for a bad World Cup. He says as well, certain German newspapers are using my background and the photo as right-wing propaganda to further their political cause. Who's he talking about here? What's been going on?
Well, there's been a lot of things going on. The fallout since this has happened and since he released this statement has been unbelievable to watch. Even politicians that you might think would understand the situation don't seem to have understood the levels of complexity around this. I mean, it's quite obvious that the AfD, the Germany's right-wing party, have gone after him, but there are certain elements of the media in terms of the Bild, what Bild have written about him have been damaging, really. I personally think this idea of saying, oh, well, he wrote this message in English, that's a problem for us, and he's not really been good enough over the last few years for this team, and it just adds fuel to the fire if there's this decision to go after an individual and say that it's about his performance when you only seem to be going after one player. Why aren't we talking about how bad Thomas Müller has been for the last 4 years? Why aren't we talking about other? And it comes back to this photo, and for obviously Mesut Ozil, he feels like if this had been a photo with any other president, he wouldn't be in this situation. He feels like this is basically just because of his heritage.
Yeah, and so, I mean, we'll get on to the fallout in just a second. Obviously, he would have released this statement by definition before the fallout from the statement. So what was going on in Bild over the previous 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks since May, I guess? Or does it predate that as well?
I think there's a general situation where Mesut Ozil seems to be being singled out in I don't want to say the German media because that's too broad speaking. I think a lot of people who have worked in the German media, who do work in the German media, have certainly looked at this collective failure from the team, from the manager, from the coaching staff, and haven't singled him out. But there have been headlines that certainly lean towards this, oh, well, Mesut Ozil is to blame. And this actually tracks back a lot further. You know, this isn't just something that's happened recently. Mesut Ozil has been the scapegoat for this Germany team for a really long time. Even at the Euros in 2016, people were calling and saying, well, why is he still in the starting 11? Why is he playing? Why is Löw still picking him? Even in 2014, when Germany were world champions, there were headlines and suggestions. Oh well, why hasn't he played? Why is he playing? He doesn't play well. This whole scapegoating of Mesut Ozil has been going on for a really long time.
And sorry to interrupt. That's an interesting point. To be fair, though, Ozil is scapegoated quite a bit in the Arsenal side. You know, like he's just one of those players who seems to attract a certain frustration. Maybe it's his body language, and sometimes
it comes back to body language.
Yeah,
it comes back to body language.
So is he misinterpreting? Is he misinterpreting at times genuine criticism, which he also gets at club level, as one that has racial undertones on a German national level?
I don't think so. He said himself, you know, I don't think other players get this level of criticism because they're not from where I'm from, or they don't have the roots that where I'm from. I mean, he's from Germany. And I think that's the key point. He feels like other players wouldn't be criticised the same way, even if they had the same body language. And you can talk about his body language as much as you like, but I don't think that represents the type of player he is. You only have to watch his games to know how he moves, and what he sees is not the same as 90% of other footballers, let alone the same ones on the pitch.
Yeah.
I think it comes back to that. I think it comes back to, why aren't we talking about other players? Why are other players not in headlines about poor performance? And why is it that this one player continually is held up as being the reason? If you look at the way that Germany played in the World Cup, it was terrible. But why is Mesut Ozil to blame for that? He's absolutely not to blame for that. And I think that's where the issues become. And
so like Bild, which is kind of right-wing tabloidy, I guess, if we have to, characterise it, Bild and others came down on him pretty specifically post-World Cup.
There was certainly this suggestion that Mesut Ozil was to blame. As I say, there were lots of headlines written about Germany's collective failure, and I really don't want to tarnish everybody in the German media the same way, because there were lots of people who said respectable things and took on the collective approach of looking at how it wasn't just the case of one individual failing. But you've got people writing opinion pieces in the Bild where I have to ask myself what their agenda is. And it doesn't seem like a particularly fair one to constantly go after Mesut Ozil. Okay.
He talks about an event in his school in Gelsenkirchen being cancelled just days beforehand. This was after the release of the photo, obviously. There were two partners involved with them. They'd been helping immigrant children over the previous year. And he said the event was cancelled then a few days before, and the school called it off for fear of what the media reaction might be. And also, and he had it in quotes, the school had obviously said this, fear of a right-wing party in Gelsenkirchen on the rise. And then he talks about another partner. It's Mercedes, clearly, who was talking about, obviously, they're the overall sponsor of the team as well. And he says that he was involved in promotional videos before the World Cup. And then when the photo came out, that was all cancelled. And he's kind of saying it's ironic because a German ministry declared their products have illegal, unauthorised software devices in them, which puts customers at risk. So he's kind of saying, what Mercedes are doing is a lot worse than anything I've done, and yet, they're the guys who are running a million miles away from me.
Yeah, and I think the business is even dirtier. I think I read somewhere the other day that Mercedes is, was it something to do with their vehicles in Turkey? And to do with the Turkish military. There are so many aspects to this conversation. I think Mesut Ozil just looked at it from his perspective and is just disappointed that he seems to have been singled out. And this whole conversation is happening in the context of football, where people are asking for criticism or more self-criticism. If we're going to go down that road, then everybody in football needs to be more self-critical. Why are we not more completely terrified by the fact that there's a World Cup in Qatar, considering the atrocities happening there? Why are we not more concerned about the German FA making deals with China and putting a Chinese under-23 team in a local league to test them out, because that seems to work well for something? There are so many aspects to this where nobody seems to want to take the blame for what they've done, but they're quite happy to tell Mesut Ozil that he's to blame for a lot of other things. And I think he's right to feel disappointed in that regard.
His statement ultimately swings around to what he describes as the most frustrating issue, and that was the meeting he had with the president of the German Football Federation, Reinhard Grindel. So he talks about Johann Löw asking him to cut his holiday short and to go to Berlin, and the plan was that Grindel and Ozil would release a joint statement together and hopefully put this thing to bed before the World Cup. And it seems Ozil found this meeting with the president of the German Football Federation, Grindel, to be a fairly grim affair. He said he was far more interested in speaking about his own political views and belittling my opinion. He says, in the eyes of Grindel, this must be one of the biggest stories in German football. In the eyes of Grindel and his supporters, I am German when we win. I'm an immigrant when we lose. And he cites a speech that Grindel gave in Parliament when he was a German Member of Parliament back in 2004, when, according to Ozil, Grindel claimed that multiculturalism is in reality a myth and a lifelong lie. And he said he'd never forget the fact that Grindel said something like that. So he has gone after Grindel here more than anyone.
Yeah, and I have to say, I think most of Germany would agree that Reinhard Grindel's handling of this situation has been abominable. He's not done a good job. The German FA collectively hasn't done a good job. And even their statement in response to what Mesut Ozil said read a bit like, here are lots of words and here's how we're doing and dealing with integration so well. But actually we haven't been able to support Mesut Ozil well enough in this situation. As I said at the beginning, it's a nuanced conversation. You can take the stance, even as the German FA, that you don't agree with the photo of Ozil with Erdogan, and you think it's conflicting for the values of the DFB. But you, at the same time, you can certainly support your player in the face of racial abuse, rather than just letting him stand there and have to suffer what he's suffered from the right wing. That's the biggest frustration for me, for him, for so many people watching on from the outside. How is it that the German FA hasn't been able to give this player a certain level of protection? And I think it comes back to this situation that we talked about earlier, where a lot of people in leading positions don't seem to be able to put themselves in the shoes of Mesut Ozil and the life that he has and he's had to grow up into and the experiences that he's had. Maybe if we had an ability to look and understand and appreciate what other people have gone through, then maybe we could have an honest and open discussion about that and try and understand why he would have taken a photo with him, rather than accusing them of being the reason for a sporting failure or you know, going after them even worse. And I think Grindel has a lot to answer for. I really don't see how he survives after this, because that's the headline quote. Yeah, that is the absolute headline quote. I am German when we win and an immigrant when we lose. And he's not alone. I remember reading Romelu Lukaku's piece on the Players' Tribune. I remember reading Karim Benzema in SoFoot. This is not the first time that a player has talked about how their integration has played a role when they are losing, and it doesn't play a role when they're winning.
The German Football Federation statement that you mentioned, which is just a bunch of words more than anything, they don't actually mention Reinhard Grindel at all or address the criticisms of Grindel at all in their 472-word riposte. Apparently he's on holiday at the moment.
Yeah, the irony of that is that he said that when Mesut Ozil came back from holiday, he would have to give a statement. Well, one, he's given that statement, whether you like it or not. And two, when you get back on holiday, you're going to have to give another one, Sunshine, because he's going to have some serious answering to do. And as I say, I really don't see him staying in office. And that bit at the end where Ozil says, I cannot continue to wear this jersey whilst this racism continues to exist. That, for me, suggests has left the door very, very, very quietly. He's left it open. Because if Grindel goes and there are serious structural changes in the DFB, there's no reason why Mesut Ozil couldn't walk back. I personally don't think he will, because I think he has burnt so many bridges by doing this, and he's taken such a strong stance that I don't see him coming back to this German national team. But what kind of a message does that send to future footballers in Germany if Mesut Ozil, one of the most important, one of the best players in the last 10 years, has said he doesn't want to wear the Germany shirt because of racism? So,
when you try and boil down Ozil's biggest issue here, so Grindel, for sure, that meeting went very, very badly, and clearly he was aware of what Grindel had said in Parliament in 2004. So that's the president, and that's a big issue for him. You get the feeling he's not too impressed with Mercedes, and hell, I'd say they're not too impressed with him at the moment either, and maybe that would that bridge would have to be rebuilt. When we talk about the abuse, I mean, you mentioned the abuse that he's receiving. We're talking about media primarily, and I mean, does he get abuse in grounds when he plays for Germany? Is it just idiots on social media, because that's difficult for anyone to police? Do we know specifically what he's talking about when he talks about abuse?
We're talking about, I mean, he even mentions in the statement, he says the abuse that he's got in stadiums. I think there are a couple of examples in the statement where he talks about people referencing his Turkish heritage and shouting abuse at him and telling him to piss off, you know, and I, with lots of other words attached that I'd rather not use. And I think that's one aspect of it. Absolutely, the social media comes into play, but you're also talking less the media and more the political side of things, where Germany's AfD, the right-wing parties, basically come in, well, far right. They've basically come in and they've started to go after him and say, oh, this idea of Germany would be better without you, and you've obviously done this because you support Erdogan. This Germany, we need to have a pure Germany team. And this incident, you know, this is such an underlying issue now in Germany. This Ozil incident has now thrown up. This is a question now. Does Germany have a problem with racism? And I think the way that the DFB have handled this, the way that this has continued to be a conversation, and how everybody seems to want to get involved without necessarily trying to understand how other people have experienced it, suggests that it absolutely does. I mean, this is a huge issue way beyond football, and it comes back to this sentiment of one man in this situation, in a leading position, feels like he has been on the receiving end of racial abuse from political parties, political figures, from individuals, from people that were so-called fans of his. This is a player who was voted German Player of the Year 5 times. 5 times by fans. And how many of those people are now turning around saying, oh, I'm glad that you're not playing for the German national team anymore?
In terms of the fallout in terms of the fallout, so the right wing are doing what we might have anticipated here. So Alice Fidel, who's co-leader of the far-right Alternative for Deutschland party, who scared the living hell out of me, I must say.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it's kind of frightening. They're getting close to having enough. They're getting close to that magical 5% mark, as I understand it, to be in Parliament pretty soon.
The last election, they won. They had 13%, I think, of the last election. I think I'm right in saying it was the first time that they had someone back in the Bundestag since 1945. So this is already a real problem. This is already growing. Well,
on Monday, she described Ozil as a typical example of the failed integration of far too many immigrants from Turkish Muslim cultural circles. So that's the far-right opinion. He is attracting criticism from the left as well, which makes it kind of interesting, I guess, because of Erdogan. And, you know, like, this guy is basically segueing nicely into the role of dictator, and he's sacked thousands of civil servants and judges and academics and military and locked up journalists, and has now pretty much locked in his quote-unquote executive presidency. So this is not a good time in Turkey. I saw Paul Ziemiak, who's with he's a centrist politician, and he was saying no one with a sensible mind wants Mesut Ozil to deny his heritage, but to claim that a photo with Erdogan in the middle of the Turkish elections came about without political intentions is naive. And you see, I didn't realise why this was such a big issue in Germany when this first happened, but the issue of Turkish immigrants in particular in Germany is one that we should talk about. So, you know, Ozil asks, are there criteria for being fully German that I do not fit? My friends Podolski and Miroslav Klose are never referred to as German Polish. So why am I German Turkish? Is it because it's Turkey? Is it because I'm a Muslim? I think here lays an important issue by being referred to as German Turkish. So he says this is an important issue. Turkey, as I understand it, so 60s or so, 1960s, there's a labour shortage in Germany, and many Turkish people moved to Germany with the attention, I think, at the time on both sides of being temporary guest workers. And then as life, you know, kind of happens, lots of people stayed. And we're talking about 3 to 4 million people in Germany of Turkish descent. And it seems that integration, particularly for various reasons, I presume, are too complicated for us to fully touch on. But it does seem like integration between those Turkish immigrants and their sons and grandsons and daughters has not been smooth in particular.
But that's the irony of the statement, though. 4 years ago, or even 8 years ago, we were talking about Germany being the successful, in the football context now, being the successful nation of integrating players with Turkish roots into the team, and being capable of bringing those players into an environment where they felt more German, in whatever that means, but, you know, feeling like they wanted to play for Germany. That's what makes Alex Vidal's comments in the AfD so baffling and so confusing, because you're talking about an integration plan that 4 years ago everybody was lauding. Germany won the World Cup with this team that had players in it from everywhere, and it showed that Germany was capable of doing that.
But was that the feeling on the ground, Jonathan? Because I've been reading various things where Turkish immigrants and, first generation, second generation Turkish immigrants are saying things like, we don't feel accepted, we're pressurised into giving up our identity if we want to be accepted, our religion is a problem for German people. And then, not to help matters, because Turkish people can still vote in Turkish elections, you still in 2014 have Erdogan visiting Germany and campaigning, and, he is saying integration yes, assimilation no. He's stirring this whole thing up. It's basically the exact opposite to what Merkel had been calling for. She had been calling for assimilation. And Erdogan's almost kind of posing as the patron of the Turkish diaspora, is how Der Spiegel put it. So he's a very contentious figure. When we're talking about Ozil posing with this guy, it's not just like the liberals on the left who are saying, well, you shouldn't pose with this dictator. It's also playing into the hands of the right wing and very genuine issues that seem to be ongoing with Turkish immigrants.
Yeah, no, it's a huge issue, and that's why the taking of the photo is a major problem, and why Ozil's lack of self-criticism in that regard is troubling, and it's a real problem, because Mesut Ozil, in that statement, by not saying, I can understand that the timing of it was a problem, I can understand that from a German perspective that this photo was wrong, the fact that none of that's in there is a huge problem, absolutely, because I think a lot of people would have taken the statement a lot more, not seriously, that's the wrong word, but would have been more accepting of the statement if he'd been more self-critical. And I think that's an absolutely okay stance to have. The reflection that has on what that means to Mesut Ozil and his inability to disrespect Turkey, because I think that's obviously what he's saying. I don't want to disrespect my heritage, whoever the president is. That's Mesut Ozil's choice. I think everybody who lives in Germany who has Turkish heritage will see it differently, will have their own opinion of it based on how they've experienced growing up in Germany, based on how they experience their connections to Turkey and how they see Erdogan. But obviously for Ozil to say, I don't think it was a political event is naive, but that's what I said at the beginning. Maybe that's just the truth. Maybe he is just, in that incident, naive enough to say he's just someone that I don't want to be rude to. Now, that might not be enough for a lot of people, and I can understand why it wouldn't be enough. But maybe that's just the truth. Because,
people might feel he was pressurised into doing the photo, but Emre Can was there and declined to get in the photo. It should be just said.
You can choose. There was absolutely a choice. Absolutely.
I mean, look, the whole thing is the fallout is as contentious and messy, and this is going to run and run. I dare say we might be checking in with you in a few weeks' time to see where we are. But you even have Uli Hoeneß, president of the biggest football club in the country, weighing in with his idiotic attack.
But I don't understand. I really don't understand what Uli Hoeneß has got to do with that. I don't understand why Lothar Matthäus needs to talk about the fact that his performance, why he feels Mesut Ozil's performance hasn't been good for the last few years. Business?
Didn't Matthäus say he doesn't look right in a German shirt? Was that a loaded comment, or was it just poorly phrased?
I think most things that Lothar Matthäus says of late have been poorly phrased, to be honest with you. But and the irony of all of that is that why is there no criticism of Lothar Matthäus meeting Vladimir Putin?
Yeah, well, Ozil asked that question. Uli Hoeneß, by the way, for people who are wondering what he said, I'm sure you may have seen it, but he's saying, I'm glad he's finished. He's been playing dirt for years. He last won a tackle before the 2014 World Cup, and now he hides himself in his crap performances behind his photo. His 30 million follower boys, even that line, his 30 million follower boys, who of course do not exist in the real world, think he's played excellently if he plays a cross to a man. Whenever we played against Arsenal, we played over him because we knew he's the weak point. I love that Uli Hoeneß, who has cheated the German taxpayer out of 25 million, is so outraged.
It's so disrespectful because on the one level, he chooses to ignore the absolute major point of Mesut Ozil's statement, which is racism.
Yeah.
Right? and the political issue of the photo. He chooses to ignore that, and then he talks about the sport, which he then wrongly assesses. Ozil has not been playing dirt for those many years. In fact, Thomas Muller, why aren't we talking about, for example, why aren't we talking about Thomas Muller not playing very well for Germany in the last few years? There are loads of other players that we could be talking about. And yet his choice to go out and have these comments is absolutely baffling. And I don't understand why the president of one of the biggest clubs in the world feels the need to even get involved in this. It's only in this incident, his best decision would have been to say nothing or to show some level of support for Ozil in the face of the racist abuse. He could have said, I don't think the photo with Erdogan was the right decision, but I will say that I don't think Mesut Ozil should be suffering the racist abuse that he did. We had none of that. Okay. None of that. Just a decision to talk about his performances.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess we all await the end of President Reinhard Grindel's holiday as much as anything, and we'll see what happens. Jonathan Harding, thanks so much. Much appreciated.
Always a pleasure.